This is chapter 3 of 12 Years a Slave. Some 3 hours elapsed, during which time I remained seated on the low bench, absorbed in painful mediations. At length, I heard the crowing of a cock, and soon a distant rumbling sound, as of carriages hurrying through the streets, came to my ears, and I knew that it was day. No ray of light, however, penetrated my prison. Finally, I heard footsteps immediately overhead, as of someone walking to and fro. It occurred to me then that I must be in an underground apartment, and the damp, moldy odors of the place confirmed the supposition. The noise above continued for at least an hour when, at last, I heard footsteps approaching from without. A key rattled in the lock, a strong door swung back upon its hinges, admitting a flood of light, and two men entered and stood before me. One of them was a large, powerful man, 40 years of age perhaps, with dark, chestnut-colored hair, slightly interspread with gray. His face was full, his complexion flushed, his features grossly coarse, expressive of nothing but cruelty and cunning. He was about 5 feet 10 inches, of full habit, and, without prejudice, I must be allowed to say, was a man of whose whole appearance was sinister and repugnant. His name was James H. Birch. As I leaned forwards, a well-known slave dealer in Washington, and then, or lately connected in business as a partner, with Theophilus Freeman of New Orleans. The person who accompanied him was a simple lackey named Ebenezer Radburn, who acted merely in the capacity of turnkey. Both of these men still live in Washington, or did, at the time of my return through that city from slavery in January last. The light admitted through the open door enabled me to observe the room in which I was confined. It was about 12 feet square, the walls of solid masonry. The floor was of a heavy plank. There was one small window, crossed with great iron bars, with an outside shutter securely fastened. An iron-bound door led to an adjoining cell, or vault, wholly destitute of windows, or any means of admitting light. The furniture of the room in which I was consisted of the wooden bench on which I sat, an old-fashioned, dirty box stove, and besides these, in either cell, there was neither bed, nor blanket, nor anything whatsoever. The door through which Birch and Radburn entered led through a small passage, up a flight of steps into a yard, surrounded by a brick wall 10 or 12 feet high, immediately in the rear of a building of the same width as itself. The yard extended rearward from the house about 30 feet. In one part of the wall, there was a strongly ironed door, opening to a narrow, covered passageway, leading along one side of the house into the street. The doom of the colored man, upon whom the door leading out of that narrow path closed, was sealed. The top of the wall supported on one end a roof which ascended inwards, forming a kind of open shed. Underneath the roof, there was a crazy loft all around, where slaves, if disposed, might sleep at night, or in inclement weather seek shelter from the storm. It was like a farmer's barnyard in some respects, save it was so constructed from the outside world could never see the human cattle that were herded there. The building to which the yard was attached was 2 stories high, fronting on one of the public streets of Washington. Its outside presented only the appearance of a quiet private residence. A stranger looking at it would never have dreamed of its execrable uses. Strange as it may seem, within plain sight of this same house, looking down from its commanding height upon it, was the Capitol building. The voices of patriotic representatives boasting of freedom and equality, and the rattling of the poor slaves' chains almost commingled. A slave pen within the very shadow of the White House. Such is a correct description as it was in 1841 of Williams's slave pen in Washington, in one of the cellars of which I found myself so unaccountably confined. "Well, my boy, how do you feel now?" said Birch, as he entered through the open door. I replied that I was sick, and inquired the cause of my imprisonment. He answered that I was his slave, that he had bought me, and that he was about to send me to New Orleans. I asserted aloud and boldly that I was a freeman, a resident of Saratoga, where I had a wife and children who were also free, and that my name was Northup. I complained bitterly of the strange treatment I had received, and threatened, upon my liberation, to have satisfaction for this wrong. He denied that I was free, and with an emphatic oath, declared that I came from Georgia. Again and again I asserted I was no man's slave, and insisted upon his taking off my chains at once. He endeavored to hush me as if he feared my voice would be overheard, but I would not be silent, and denounced the authors of my imprisonment, whoever they might be, as unmitigated villains. Finding he could not quiet me, he flew into a towering passion. With blasphemous oaths, he called me a black liar, a runaway from Georgia, and every profane and vulgar epithet that the most indecent fancy could conceive. During this time, Radburn was standing silently by. His business was to oversee this human, or rather inhuman stable, receiving slaves, feeding and whipping them at the rate of 2 shillings a head per day. Turning to him, Birch ordered the paddle and cat o' nine tails to be brought in. He disappeared and in a few moments returned with these instruments of torture. The paddle, as it termed in slave-beating parlance, or at least the one which I was first became acquainted, and of which I now speak, was a piece of hardwood board, 8 or 20 inches long, molded to the shape of an old-fashioned pudding stick, an ordinary oar. The flattened portion, which was about the size and circumference of 2 open hands, was bored with a small auger in numerous places. The cat was a large rope of many strands, the strands unraveled and a knot tied at the extremity of each. As soon as these formidable whips appeared, I was seized by both of them, and roughly divested of my clothing. My feet, as had been stated, were fastened to the floor. Drawing me over the bench, face downwards, Radburn placed his heavy foot upon the fetters between my wrists, holding them painfully to the floor. With the paddle, Birch commenced beating me. Blow after blow was infected by my naked body. When his unrelenting arm grew tired, he stopped and asked if I still insisted I was a free man. I did insist upon it, and then the blows were renewed, faster and more energetically, if possible, than before. When again tired, he would repeat the same question, and receiving the same answer, continue his cruel labor. All this time, the incarnate devil was uttering the most fiendish oaths. At length the paddle broke, leaving the useless handle in his hand. Still, I would not yield. All his brutal blows could not force him from my hips the foul lie that I was a slave. Casting madly on the floor the handle of the broken paddle, he seized the rope. This was far more painful than the other. I struggled with all my power, but it was in vain. I prayed for mercy, but my prayer was only answered with imprecations and with stripes. I thought I must die beneath the lashes of the accused brute. Even now the flesh crawls upon my bones as I recall the scene. I was all on fire. My sufferings I can compare to nothing else but the burning agonies of hell. Chapter 3, 12 Years a Slave.